everybody, it's Steve here. Just to let you know that this discussion with Dylan and Hollie proved to be so beneficial that we've decided to split it into two podcast recordings, and you're about to listen to podcast number 1 of a 2-part series. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Export to Japan podcast, brought to you in conjunction with the British Embassy in Tokyo. And on this edition, we are looking at the world of the games sector in Japan. And I have two great guests to tell us more about that. Welcome to Dylan and Hollie, who are joining us from Q-Games based in Kyoto in Japan. Hi, guys, welcome.
Hi there.
Hi, we're really glad to be here. Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
it's our pleasure. Great to have you on board. And in a moment, I'm just going to dive in and start picking Hollie and Dylan's brains to learn more about their experience. But before we do that, just a quick mention, as always, to say if you would love to hit that subscribe button and hit the like button, that would help us immensely. We've got a great range of new podcasts coming along and some great guests coming along. So if you subscribe, you will be notified in advance. Okay, without further ado, let's dive in and learn more about the game sector. So Dylan, I'd love to start with you. And could you kick off by telling us a little bit about your initial journey into Japan? What were those trigger points? When did you first come to Japan and why?
Yeah, well, it's a long, long time ago. I was 17 and I joined Argonaut Software in London. And it was a very small company at the time. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was a small company of like 7 people. And we hacked a Game Boy. So the boss, Jez-san, had obtained a Game Boy from somewhere, from some show or something. Yeah. And then we hacked it and said, okay, we're going to get 3D running on this, like, 3D, wireframe 3D, not polygons, but wireframe 3D. And we hacked it together. We actually took a cartridge and we put wires coming out of it and stuff like this, and had like a CCD TV pointed at that little tiny screen, and and showing on a TV, so I could actually see what was going on. And we actually got 3D running on it. And then Jez-san, he was quite a good sort of businessman, so he went out to CES in America and started showing this 3D demo we got running on the Game Boy, showing it around to everybody in America, or anybody could. And a young guy who had just started, or had recently joined Nintendo America, called Tony Harmon, saw it, and he was like, "Wow, okay." And he also saw it as a chance to kind of get into the Japanese side of Nintendo as well. It's like, so for his own career, it was a good chance to grasp as well. And so he leapt on that, and basically ended up flying me and Jez over to Japan, to Kyoto, like 2 weeks later. So wow. So Jez suddenly got back from CES and he said, Dylan, have you got a passport? And I was like, luckily I'd just gone to France, because it wasn't, we actually needed passports back then to go to France. And I'd actually got one. And so we basically flew over 2 weeks later, business class as well. So like I was like 18, I think I just turned 18 around that time. And it was like business class and British Airways, and we kind of flew over, and I had no idea where I was going. Because at the time, Nintendo wasn't really a big thing in the UK. So
okay, so it's even back before those days, before
it was like
brand awareness in the UK.
Yeah, it was like kind of, I mean, you kind of knew of Nintendo, but it wasn't the big thing it is now. And they didn't have a UK office, and the Nintendo machines, like the Famicom and the NES, they were distributed by Bandai Namco at that point in the UK. But so we all flew over. There's Tony Harmon and Jez-san and me, and also Jez-san's girlfriend at the time for some reason. But so we all flew over, and we arrived at there wasn't, the Kansai International Airport didn't exist then, so we arrived at this little kind of local airport, which is Itami, and I remember it was like July, probably like July 4th, July 1st, sometime like that. And we get in, and Japan is like so hot, at that time of year. And I remember the doors opening at the airport, just kind of the doors opened, and like this rush of heat, like a sauna, hit me. And with like a faint smell of, I remember there's like a faint smell of yuzu, which is like a Japanese citrus fruit. And I didn't know what that was at the time, but it's this faint smell of views are in the air as well. And we grabbed a taxi and we headed. It was like kind of evening, and it just turned dark. We ended up driving. The taxi ended up taking us to Kyoto, to the hotel in Kyoto. And I remember looking out the taxi window while we were going there, because it's my first time in like a really truly foreign country. I mean, France doesn't really count, doesn't really count.
It's a slightly bigger step than France.
Yeah, right. It's a completely different country, and a completely different side of the world. And I remember looking out the window, and the first thing that struck me was the sheer amount of vending machines, like everywhere. Vending machines, like just every single corner, And I was like, wow, if in the UK these would all be vandalized. I remember that just going through my mind. It's like, God, I wish the UK didn't have vandalism, because this is actually kind of cool.
Dylan, does that say something about the UK or about you as an 18-year-old? I'm just wondering.
Well, yeah, I was.
No, I'm just joking. I'm teasing.
No, it's true. I wasn't too wild. Although I was kind of in my goth fashion. I wasn't a goth, but I was kind of in that fashion mode at that point. I liked, But anyway, so I was only 18, right? So we end up going to this hotel. In the middle. We arrived at late at night, and it's suddenly I'm staying in I'm 18. I haven't really stayed at a decent hotel before like this. I've stayed at like a small little place or a bed and breakfast, but it's like a proper hotel. And there's like a bar and a lobby, and and I'm just enjoying myself. And this is after coming over on business class as well, which is like a completely weird, great experience. And then the people who met us in the lobby, after we arrived, one of them was Miyamoto, like the guy who made Mario. And and at that point I didn't know who he was, so it was just introduced to me like, this is Miyamoto. But at that point, I didn't know who he was. But we ended up, everybody gets talking, and we kind of had a light drink and then called it a night. We were all pretty tired at that point from the jet lag. And then the next morning, so we head into Nintendo, so the big HQ, and we get a taxi to the entrance of Nintendo, and it was just like, it was so weird. So this is the weirdest thing. So in the UK at that point, the games industry was tiny. So each little studio was like 7 or 8 people, 9 people. Maybe Ocean a few years earlier was about 20 people max, right? Suddenly we're going to this like big building, like multiple floors full of people, and it was like a really an eye opener. Like,
totally. Yeah,
I guess you weren't expecting that.
I wasn't expecting it, because it was actually a big proper company, right? And in the UK, Argonaut at that point was working out of a semi-detached house in Mill Hill, like a 3-story semi-detached house. And so we just
picture it. You as a young 18-year-old, and from the story you're telling us here, sort of 3 weeks prior to this trip, you had no idea the trip was even coming, right?
So no, nothing at all.
To plan, to culturally adjust, to do your homework, to do the research. You literally had to get your passport together and pack your bag, and you're heading off to this crazy country.
Exactly. It's lucky I made it, really. But it was such a big shock, right? So it was suddenly very official, I suppose. Like it was like the proper games industry,
right?
Compared to the ragtag situation we had in the UK. And I'm kind of curious. I'd love to speak to like business leaders from back then, like in the 80s in the UK, right? Because there must have been a big chance in the UK really to grow the industry further in the 80s, I think. And because if Nintendo could get to that size in just like 8 years, and the early Mario games at that point weren't selling like 10s and 20s and 30 million units like they do now. It was much smaller. So it's like, like by that time, I mean, this is like 1990. And so you think, well, the UK kind of wasted that opportunity a little bit, right? Like in the 80s, they could have been something there, right? And we could have actually built something a bit bigger even. But I think British people, they just like that homegrown, working out of the bedroom kind of feel. Maybe that's why. But
I mean, there is a big cultural difference there, isn't there? You're absolutely right. The point you touched on, and that the whole thing about the Japanese way of looking at sort of long-term investment and long-term vision. There's a number of different steps there, isn't there? But let's just hit the pause button there for 1 second. I want to where we are, but I just want to bring Hollie in as well and hear your experience, Hollie, because I don't think it's quite as time served as Dylan's, but nevertheless equally as interesting. So just tell us a little bit more about your journey to Japan, Hollie. Please.
Absolutely, yeah. So not quite as long as Dylan's experience in Japan. I guess I'll start kind of at the beginning for me joining the industry. So I've worked in the games industry now for around 10 years. I started out in journalism way back when, and then I started moving over into marketing and public relations. I realized that that's what I really enjoyed. And I worked in the UK for the majority of my career until maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, when I really started wondering what the games industry in Japan was like. And I love Japan as a country. I visited a bunch of times. I love the culture, the food, obviously, does that need saying? The food is amazing. And I'd visited on holiday a bunch of times.
How many times?
3 times.
All right, that's good. That's quite a lot.
And I would use all of my annual leave. I would literally take every single day of holiday that I had, and I would use it to come on holiday to Japan.
And Hollie, were your initial flights business class by any chance?
What do you think? No, they weren't. So I was coming over on holiday and I was really loving it. And it kind of got me thinking, I'm spending every spare day that I have of holiday flying halfway around the world to come here. I want to live here. Like, why don't I just look at living here? And initially that's kind of, at that point, it sounded to me like a scary thing. I was thinking, oh, that's far away and it's scary. And it actually turns out it's not so scary as it first kind of seems. So I started doing my research and looking into the industry. And obviously I'd worked in the UK industry for a long time, and I'd done a lot of Western releases. So my background is in publishing. So I'd done a lot of publishing in the West, but not so much in Japan, because as I think we're going to discuss, a lot of companies in the West see publishing in Japan as kind of a scary thing. So I started doing my research and I started talking to people who are here, Dylan being the perfect example. And I ended up talking to Dylan, and at the time I was working for Sumo Digital in the UK, and I was working there, and we just got talking, and I had questions for Dylan about, what is it like in Japan? And my Japanese, I'm not fluent in Japanese by an absolute mile. My Japanese is very casual. So we're having conversations about that and what's it like in Kyoto, because I'd actually never visited Kyoto. And that's something that people are usually quite surprised about. The first time that I visited Kyoto was when I arrived to live here. So that was quite an interesting part of my story. But so I spoke to Dylan, and moving to Japan seemed like an amazing opportunity. There's some really cool things going on here at Q-Games. So I joined the team back in November a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. And I worked 6 months remote. And then in April, when the borders allowed, I arrived in Kyoto for the first time, and I've been here for 6 months.
That's great. And how did you find, I mean, you obviously had your previous trips to Japan and your holidays and things, which is great. So you obviously got a very good feel of the Japanese culture, but did it feel any different 6 months ago when you first arrived, knowing that you're now sort of a more permanent move across and you're working there and living there? How was that when you first arrived? What were your initial feelings?
It's really hard to describe, because on some hands it felt crazy, really crazy. And partly because it was like a dream come true for me. It was something that I'd really wanted for a number of years. So been able to do that was really special. But then at the same time, it just felt completely normal and right. And adapting to living in Japan isn't super difficult.
Especially in Kyoto.
Yeah, especially in Kyoto. Especially a city like this that is so used to tourists. And I haven't seen that yet, because I moved here, obviously, in the shadow of the pandemic, and tourists aren't fully back yet. But anywhere you go, train stations support English language and multiple other languages as well. So I haven't really faced any major difficulties when it comes to adjusting. So it just kind of felt okay. Obviously, there are some things that are very different. There is a language barrier. If you're doing things like you're going to the ward office and you're trying to do something complicated, if you're talking about tax, count me out, because that's complicated enough in English, never mind in Japanese. So there definitely are some barriers there, but I don't think they're, you know, unsurmountable. They're not things that you can't get through. And especially if you have the backing of a company, like the support that I've had from Q, and I'm not just saying this because Dylan is sat here, but having the kind of support that I've had from Q has made this whole process incredibly smooth. So it's definitely doable.
Awesome.
I think if anyone out there is thinking maybe that they want to do it, I would say just go for it.
Yeah. I mean, especially like Kyoto as well, it's very multicultural. So very much an international city, I think. And of course, it used to be the capital of Japan. You know, some people probably don't realize that, but maybe 100 and not that long ago, really, like 150 years ago, some time like that. So it means that there's just a lot of culture in the city as well, like old culture. But it's also mixed with like this sort of international culture as well. So there's a lot of like there's a lot of Western food, and there's a lot of Japanese food. You pretty much eat any kind of food you want here. And it's just a great place, and it's not too big, and it's not too small. I think the population is about the population of Manchester.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
I can't remember which, but we're still not, you know, we're not in the top. I don't think we're even in the top 10 popular cities in Japan. So that gives you a sense of like the population centers, you know, how many people live in all these cities in Japan. And a big difference between Japan and the West as well, just to touch on that, is especially in the UK, people like to live in the country and commute in. You had some trouble today getting in, right? But they, you know, you commute into a town or a city or to an office. But in Japan, people love living in the cities because the cities are safe and they're clean. They have lots of it's like convenience, just convenience in general, and just so much good food, and I think that whole like attitude means there's a completely different balance between country living and city living in Japan compared to the UK. So I mean, it's always something we joke about, you know, when people say if a Japanese person is talking to someone from the UK and like they say, oh yeah, in the UK I want to live out in the middle of nowhere in this house, and the Japanese will just look at them and just go, what? Why do you want to live out in the middle of nowhere? Like there's nothing to do. So it's an interesting difference, isn't it? That is actually quite a big cultural difference. But the cities are clean and they're well lit, and there's no real crime. I mean, that's a big difference as well. Like no petty crime. I mean, very little at least compared to the West.
I mean, do you on that point, Dylan? And we're just jumping around a bit, but there's this point you're bringing out here, because I know from a business point of view, from a sort of business ethics point of view, you know, people talk about Japan being a little different. Do you, with all your years of experience of doing business there, do you have any comment on that or any view on that, Dylan?
That's an interesting question, really. In the UK, obviously, I didn't run a business in the UK, but I felt that in the UK, there's a lot of, from what I did. So I did a lot of, I did work in a few places in the UK. I did work experience at like a City of London mainframe software company and stuff like that, like right near the Tower of London. Like when I was like 15 or 16, I was like programming on this mainframe. And I got a sense of what like the corporate life or the office life was like in London. And I felt it's quite different really to Japan in that sense. But I think I felt like in some ways it felt like it was more a little bit more casual in the West, but kind of stuffy as well. So like everybody was kind of just doing what their job is, if you know what I mean. So like you know, we have that word jobs worth in the UK, and I think that there's a bit of that in the UK that I sensed when I was working at these there. Not so much in the games industry at that time, because that was more of a sort of homegrown kind of thing. But in these office situations, it kind of felt a little bit like that. And in Japan, I didn't really get a sense of that. So in Japan, when I go and meet other companies and stuff like that, I get a sense that people kind of, because they're lifelong employees, right? So they kind of put their, I mean, that's it. That's their life. I suppose, like a major percentage of their life. They're not going to switch jobs.
Yeah.
So a lot of the people I'll go and speak to, say at Nintendo or at Sony, are people I've went and spoke to 20 years ago or 25 years ago, the same people. And so you get these like very long-term relationships, which is great. Yeah. So, for example, on the TV the other day, Sony was showing their EV, their new EV car. It was on the news. Like, you know, they've just created this company called, I think it's called, like, it's got a stupid name, Mobility, I think it's called, something like that, some very simple name like that. But it's a company that's been created by, I think, Honda and Sony. And there's this guy on the stage, and he's talking about the car, and he's going on about it, and I'm like, I know him. You know, I worked with him like 15 years ago, you know, when we were doing PlayStation 3 and stuff for Sony. He was heading up the PlayStation 3 stuff at Sony at that point, and now he's heading up the EV, you know, the EV stuff at Sony, the EV car. And I was like, and that's great, right? It's like, and you don't really get as much of that in the West, I think. There's a lot more hopping around.
I think it comes back to this theme we touched on a bit earlier about this kind of longer term view and investment in everything you do, including your employer, right? So many young graduates go and work for these big Japanese corporates and just consider that they will invest their whole life working, and they'll take care of each other, right? The employer will look after them, and they will then commit to the employer. And it's a very interesting, different way of working.
And they do get looked after as well. So they get kind of, you know, so like, there's a lot of support, I suppose, from the company. Yeah,
sure, I get that. You know, while we're on this topic of talking about the corporates, then let's just get back to your story. So you took us as far as you know, a couple of weeks on from knowing that you'd got to get your passport, you got over to Japan, you had your first good night's sleep, and then you arrived at the big, huge corporate Nintendo office. And what was the next part of your story? What happened from that point?
So I'd also hurriedly bought a suit just in case as well. So I was actually wearing a suit, one of the few times in my life, and so was Jez-san as well. So we were all kind of smartly dressed and for a change. And then we go into the meeting room. We're sort of ushered into this meeting room, and it's, you know, me, I'm like 18, Jez-san, I think he's 23, so pretty young, and then Tony Harmon, who was, I think, 24. So we're all quite young, really. And then the door opens, and in come, like, I'd say 20 to 30, I mean, maybe not 30, but like over 20 people, like, all come in on the other side of the table, like this long table, and they're all wearing Nintendo jackets, which is part of they have like a rule that they have to wear these jackets for guests when guests are coming, especially back then. Maybe it's less so now, but back then. So they're all wearing these like Nintendo, like almost like blue collar jackets, kind of like, you know, like factory worker kind of jackets. And they all come in and they all sit down on the other side of the table. And then it's just us three on this side. And we're like, you know, and then they start talking to us. And they're all very friendly. So they all start joking around quite quickly. But, you know, in that, there are all kinds of people, like this Yokoi Gunpei, who was like a major player or major kind of mover and shaker in Nintendo back in the day. And there was Miyamoto, and there was a guy called Takeda, who was like behind the hardware type of thing. Just all these people. There's a guy called Izushi, who was one of the main people behind making the Game Boy as well. And they just said, they came in and just
one of those moments where you'd want to get your autograph book out and say, "Can I just?"
Yeah. But at that point, I didn't know who. I didn't know who any of these people were. Like, you know, that was the crazy thing. We just in there. We didn't have any. We didn't have any of that sort of gamer respect, even, like, because we didn't really know who any of these people were at this point. Nowadays, it'd be like, you know, oh, we are not worthy kind of moment, you know. But well, we were kind of cool. So we were kind of like, you know, we had a bit of confidence. You know, we were making cool shit on the Game Boy. You know, so a bit cocky. You know,
it must have been awesome trying to imagine you there. It must have been such a trip,
And then and so we show them the Game Boy, the demo, and they're all like passing it around, and they're going, "Oh, this is cool." And then Miyamoto, during the course of this, Miyamoto said, "Oh, we're just about to launch a thing called a Super Nintendo, Super NES, and we have a prototype." And so he brought a prototype in, and he showed us an early prototype of a game called Pilot's Wings. And Pilot's Wings was a kind of 3D kind of flight simulator, kind of, Nintendo-ified flight simulator type game. And maybe it's Pilot Wings. I always get the S wrong, but anyway, he showed us this, and there's an aircraft on the screen, and he said it was really annoying having to draw all the frames for the rotation of the aircraft. And he was like, can you help with this? Can we get this all, done in 3D on the Super Nintendo? He had no clue of how that could be done. And we said, but us being very cocky, we said, sure, we can do that.
What else can you say at that point? You're not going to go, I
can't do that. Yeah.
Thanks for flying us in business class, but we can't help you.
yeah. So we said, yeah, sure, we can do that. And Jez-san suddenly came up with the idea, and he suddenly said, why don't we make a chip? Why don't we put a chip on here? And there's an interesting backstory behind the reason why he thought maybe a chip could work. There used to be a company called Connex in Wales. I think it might still exist, actually. I'm not sure, but there used to be a company called Connex run by this Welsh entrepreneur, and he'd made like a joystick, like a funny little joystick called a Connex joystick, which had done really well. It sold millions in the UK, and he was kind of upcoming, and he'd made a console, and he'd begun making a console, like a UK-made console, and we'd actually done some work on this, and the people who had made the custom chips for this console were a company called Flare. And while we were working on this, we got to know them quite well, and Jez-san got to know them quite well. But then the console all kind of got, like, it ran out of money or didn't get the investment, and it just got stopped. And it was really literally right after this that we were flown over to Nintendo, and we started hacking the Game Boy and stuff, because we were looking for more stuff to do, right? We're looking for new work, basically. And so Jez basically said, well, those Flare guys, or the guys, I mean, I think Flare disbanded, but the guys involved, they're chip makers. They don't have any work right now. So he kind of did the 2 + 2, and he got it connected. And he called up a guy called Ben Cheese, who was ex-Flare, called him up directly from that Nintendo meeting room.
Oh my God, imagine picking up that phone call on the other end.
It's like, and just called straight from Kyoto. I mean, probably the middle of the night, right? And it's like, Ben, and basically they, at that point, they basically dissected the cartridge and the address lines and basically the information they could get from this new cartridge, brand new, because it's not out. The Super Nintendo isn't out at that point. They dissect the information and start working out how they can actually get signals onto a chip if they put the chip on the cartridge. And that became the Super FX chip, which Argonaut ended up making in collaboration with Nintendo, and powered games like Star Fox and Yoshi's Island and all these mid-90s games, and Doom as well. Doom on the Super Nintendo was powered by it as well. So it's
what an incredibly influential first meeting that was, right?
Right.
With that big panel of people on the other side of the table, you three guys on your side, and then this little gem of an idea comes up, and look what it went on to do. That's incredible.
And so I was there we were only there for like maybe a week, under a week even, and I fell in love with Kyoto in that week. I was just like, this is amazing. Because I've been working in North London at the time, and this is like late 80s, early 90s in North London. And it was like the difference between dystopia and utopia for me, because London was so grimy, and the Northern Line was just like, just a wreck, and it was just mucky. And every time you get home from like visiting the center of London, like you have to like blow your nose, and it's just all black, and it's just like. And then I come here and in Kyoto, and it's like everything's like bright and neon lit, and people are well dressed, and they're all the food is amazing, and the people are really friendly, and I just kind of fell in love with the place in that 1 week. And I was like, I didn't get to go back for another year after that, and during that whole year, I think I bored everyone to death talking about Kyoto. Like I just wouldn't shut up about it.
Wow.
I mean, I can relate to that as well. Yeah.
Right.
The same thing. You go to Japan, you visit, you come home, and then your friends and family are like, please, can you just either move there or stop talking about it, because this is driving us crazy. So
And actually, I have to confess, I'm in exactly the same boat as the two of you. My story is very, very similar too, almost identical. So I get what you're talking about. We can share that, definitely.
Yeah.
Amazing. So did you, from that point then, Dylan, did you continue, you know, how did the relationship continue with Nintendo? Did you ever actually join them and work for them, or could you link next little bit?
Yeah. So I was so in that week, a 3-game deal eventually was born, and also a deal to make the chip as well. So we make 3 games for the chip. And at the same time, the game I've been making on the Game Boy got signed up by Nintendo. It was originally being paid for by a company called Mindscape in the UK or in America. I can't remember where, but the Nintendo basically bought that out. And so I ended up for the next year or so making next year and a half making a game on the Game Boy, a 3D game on the Game Boy, working with the guys at Nintendo once they're but via fax. And at that time there was no email, so everything was by fax, which was hard work.
Oh, that little comment so puts it in context of where we're time-wise, doesn't it? That's incredible.
Yeah, facts.
How does that even work? What are you sending via fax?
Well, diagrams and I mean, you just write everything down and just send like 10 pages of fax over.
My word, that's
it was crazy, absolutely crazy. But most of the time we just I was just let to carry on and do my stuff. So I ended up not going back until about a year later to sort out like the finishing of that game. And around that time, the FX chip was about to be ready to be tested, and we needed to make like the flagship game for that. And we started a game called, at the time we called it SNES Glider, based on the original. Like there's a series of games called Star Glider by Argonaut Software, and we kind of nicknamed it that to begin with. But Miyamoto-san saw the beginnings of that, and he said, "Oh no, we're going to change it around. We're going to do a few things differently, and to do that, can you all come and live and work in Kyoto, to make the game?" And so that's when I moved over. So around 92, the beginning of 92. So we'd come in December or November beforehand, and we talked about it, and then he basically said, "Oh, go back for Christmas and New Year, and next time come over, bring over a bigger suitcase and stay here until the end of the project." So I didn't end up becoming like a direct employee of Nintendo, but for the next like 3 or 4 years making Star Fox and Star Fox 2, I ended up basically living and working, basically every day at Nintendo. So I was basically a kind of a contracted, almost like a contracted employee, I suppose, of Nintendo during that time, which was, a lot of fun.
Oh, it must have been, yeah. I mean, did you get the feeling they sort of took you under their wing? For example, did they help you find accommodation and settle in and all that sort of stuff? Or yeah.
So initially they put us up in a hotel for the first year, but in a room. They had special. Nintendo's always very careful about its money, so they had a special deal with the hotel, one of the hotels, and there were a set of rooms, and they were called fellowship rooms. I had no idea why, but they were a bit larger in the hotel, and they were for long staying, so for people who are coming from abroad, and they can stay longer, so they're a bit more better service, I suppose, in that sense. So we stayed there for about a year, until Nintendo saw that we were expensing our meals and everything. It was a hotel, right? So we were like, we just expense everything onto the hotel room. And they said, "Okay, no, we'll move you into a proper, like, what you call a mansion in Japan, like a flat, I suppose, or an apartment." And so they moved us all into separate flats and mansions, and then we were staying and living more in a normal accommodation. But it was fun for a while though. There, living in a hotel for a year I think I was at that point I was like 19, I think. So that was a good experience.
Yeah,
I wouldn't do it now. I wouldn't like it now. But when you're 19 or 20 or somewhere around there, it's like that's kind of exciting. And every day's like just walk out and you're in the middle of Kyoto, a completely alien city. It's great.
You must have felt like you were living the dream at that time. It must have been an incredible, mind-blowing experience, I should think.
Yeah, it was great because also, I mentioned we went British Airways the first flight, but then the second or third time we flew over, we couldn't get British Airways. It was like fully booked or something. We ended up flying Virgin upper class, and then from there, and that was so good. like from there on, it was just upper class every time. And Nintendo had a policy at the time that whenever anybody flew abroad, it would be business class. So that's why we were going business class. They changed that recently, about 20 years ago, when their employee count went a bit higher. They actually created like ranks and actually said, oh no, yeah, anyone below this rank can only go coach, and anyone above can go business. But back then, everybody was business, which meant that then that's why we were flown that way. But it was
it's kind of a shame when, as companies grow up and have to bring those new policies in, right? It's a part of the evolution of getting bigger and growing, I guess, isn't it, when those sort of things come in?
But it was a great experience though, and as you say, it felt like we were sort of top of the world, really. I mean, it just every day was new and exciting, and they were meeting lots of like really people we'd never have a chance to meet, and I don't mean people at Nintendo, and just people that you just bump into, at bars or restaurants, because everybody's so friendly here. Like that, you go to like an izakaya, which is like the sort of Japanese pub type experience, and you just start ordering stuff, and then basically you just kind of start intermingling with all the people around you, and everybody's like just diving in and sharing and drinking and chatting and laughing, and it's just a great experience. And for someone like me, when I was growing up in the UK, I was very shy and very reticent, I suppose, like very not very forward, I suppose. But suddenly being thrown into that was just an amazing experience.
Yeah. I mean, Hollie, just jumping over to you for a second, how, hearing Dylan's story here, how does that reflect on your observations? I think you're 6 months in now, you mentioned, aren't you, into living in Kyoto. Is this a good reflection of what you're finding, or do you think Kyoto's changed much from the days that Dylan is describing? What are your observations on that?
It's funny because that's the first time I've heard Dylan describe kind of that idea, and it is exactly the same. You go to an izakaya now, and a few drinks in, you end up talking to the people, the salarymen on the table next to you, or there's some other people from the UK that you bump into who want to talk to you about what they're doing. And I imagine that's only going to get more and more now tourists are starting to come back. And there definitely is a different sense, from my kind of perspective anyway, in the past 6 months, of people are willing to, I don't know, talk to each other more than you do in the UK. Like
really?
The thought of going to a pub back home and ending up chatting with the people next to you and sharing drinks and ordering a bottle of sake that you're going to share. I'm like, that wouldn't happen. Well, I mean, you wouldn't be ordering sake in a pub in the UK, but the idea is the same. So from my perspective, even though that huge amount of time has passed, very similar experiences from my side.
I feel as well that it hasn't really changed. That is just like, it's part of the like the communication, the social communication, I suppose, in Japan. It's very much based on that kind of like going out and mingling a bit. They have a great word. It's a slang kind of word. They basically mix the verb for drink, which is nomu, with communication from English, and they say nomunication. So it's like that's what they call it. So it's like, well, they don't. It's not that common a phrase, but it's a phrase that they understand, like non-communication.
Sharing some drinks and communicating.
Yeah,
the same.
Yeah,
nice. I like the sound of that.
Exactly. Yeah,
I think that sounds very.
It's a great experience.
Yeah. Well, let's just roll forward a little bit then, Dylan, because I think you then had a period in your career when you went over to the US, and that was maybe attached to Sony in some way, is it? So could you take us forward to that bit? What were the there that got you to that point, please?
So we came to the end of the contract with Nintendo. So after 3 games, we made 3 games, and I was finishing up Star Fox 2 there, and then the PlayStation came out around that time, and because Argonaut and Nintendo had like a non-poach agreement at that point, I would have actually liked to have become a Nintendo employee at that point, I think, and stayed in Kyoto, but because they had a non-poach agreement, it meant I couldn't. So I had to kind of go back, and Nintendo, to be fair, they said, okay, there's this company called HAL, which is where the future president of Nintendo came from, Iwata-san. They said they kind of tried to introduce me to that company as well, but it was like up near Mount Fuji, like it wasn't Kyoto, and the PlayStation had just come out. So I thought, okay, and there's the internet was just coming about, or just appearing around that point, and there was a service called Newsnet or Usenet, which it's kind of like the old-fashioned Reddit in a way, the old-fashioned Reddit, and someone posted on there. There was a PlayStation group on there, because it just come out, and someone posted there saying they were looking for programmers to work at Sony in America, in California. And so I sent an email to this person, and he goes, "Oh, what you know, wow, all right." And they ended up flying me over for an interview, and then giving me a job at Sony at Sony PlayStation in America. But what I didn't know at the time was at that point, PlayStation itself had only just come out in America, so it's actually very early on for Americans at least, and that was also like another massive like cultural kind of, not shock, but like well, it's very exciting, I suppose. The culture is just so different again from Japan and from the UK. Even it's completely different to the UK as well. That it was just great. It's just a really good experience, I thought, and I'm glad I got to do that rather than just stay in Kyoto the whole time. So to get that experience, to get to go and work in California, you know, where the weather's just so good, like it's just so good, and you know, they're spoiled.
And sort of an interesting contrast for you too, having had the experience of working with Nintendo, but the relationship was more on that sort of contractor basis. But then joining another huge Japanese corporation, the Sony Corporation, but then joining them in America is another sort of interesting part of the dynamic, isn't it? I mean, did you find, you'd obviously had your experience of living in Japan, working with Nintendo, but did you find when you joined Sony in the US, was it a sort of similar Japanese culture internally with the way that company was run, or was it much more of what you learned to be an American culture with the way that business was run at that time?
It was fully American.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, fully American. It was like that movie Office Space. It was like, you know, cubicles and fluorescent lighting, and you know, it kind of a bit depressing in a way, like very much like, you know, like 1984 kind of thing. Like it just felt, I mean, outside of the office, outside of that sort of corporate kind of office, California is amazing. You know, beautiful scenery, just great. And this is pre first .com, so it was 96. So it's like really early on. So the internet is just bubbling up, like, but not really anything commercial yet, like before .com hit. So the prices weren't too high, and you could live in like a nice place, and it's just great. But the company, you know, the corporate culture in a way was very American, and very kind of a bit dry in a way, a bit, you know, a bit boring. The people weren't dry, but like everything was kind of the same, you know. It's like all the grey walls and the grey desks, and you know, nothing was very exciting in that sense. But you know, we made it exciting. So me and I brought over a few people from Argonaut as well, because we were looking to build a team, and so we had these like core Brits in this, you know, American corporate company, and we would be out in the fountain outside, you know, stripping off, or and of course, and this is the first time I encountered HR, right? Because I've never heard of I don't even know what HR is at that time. Like Nintendo didn't have HR. Yeah, Argonaut didn't have HR. And so we were quite often summoned to HR and said, you know,
it sounds like HR found you rather than you finding HR.
Yeah. But also there were some interesting differences in the sense that, for example, in the American corporate sort of culture, especially at that point, at least, pretty much the hours you work each day, it's like during the day as well, you could just basically just go out. You could like go to Fry's Electronics for like 3 hours and just buy electronics, and then come back to the office. And you were kind of, you know, you were meant to put in all the hours, but some people definitely didn't. But you know, it was a very loose kind of flexi time kind of situation, which I hadn't experienced really until then. Even Argonaut had like a strict start time, you know, like 10. I think it's like 10 a.m. And Nintendo was very strict, you know, with their hours. They had a bell, so like, you know, 8:45, a pre-bell would ring, which is like, get your desks, then at 9 o'clock, the proper bell, like start work kind of bell rang, and then at lunchtime you'd have a bell, and then 5 minutes before the end of lunchtime you'd have another, like, get to your desks bell, and then at 1 p.m. there'd be another bell, and basically, so Nintendo is that was a very old school kind of mentality. That's only just recently loosened up at Nintendo, like seriously, probably thanks to Corona, actually. Like maybe in the last 5 years that's changed a little bit. Now they have 3 choices of start time at Nintendo, and then you kind of, within that, it's not flexi, but you know, at least you get a different start time. But anyway, so go back to America. In America, it was very much not like that, and like pretty much anyone was going wherever they wanted to at any point. And there was also, like, I don't know, say this on the podcast, but there's a bit of a weed culture in California, right? And that was quite a shock to me, like, because even in the UK when I was growing up, there wasn't any of that, and so that was quite, whoa, all right, and everybody's just very blatant about it as well. So very laid back kind of thing, but all fitted into this like grey, bland cubicle hellscape of an office. The office is like a hellscape, really. It's just like bland as hell, and but I enjoyed I enjoyed my time there. I mean, I think 2 to 3 years was about the max I could deal with, and then but it was a great experience.
I mean, what did you find with that experience? There's so many fun benefits you're talking about there, and I guess you got a lot out of it. But were you also missing Japan fairly early on into that experience, or did you just park Japan up for a while and just focus on your new life in the US for a bit?
Yeah, for a couple of years, I just focused on the new life. But I found that it was a weird balance. So even though it was like, as I mentioned, like sort of that sort of flexi time, very free and open, the most pressure I've ever experienced was in the US at work. The most pressure to produce and to kind of do stuff was in California. And I think maybe it's because they have that quick fire thing, right? So everybody's under it's a bit of a sort of boiling cauldron, because if you can be fired within 2 weeks, and people are often, quite quickly fired, it means that everybody's kind of working really hard at some points. So there's all this loose stuff kind of to balance that, but at the same time, like way too much pressure to kind of perform. I found, and that's, so after 2 years of that, I kind of got sick of that kind of, I thought maybe the middle ground's better. I began to feel, not, it just started to get very stressful, I suppose. So during that last year, definitely the urge to go back to Japan started coming, like bubbling up in me, and I was like, I kind of want to go back now. I've really enjoyed this experience, but I think it's time to go back. So I applied for a transfer, and they transferred me to Tokyo, in the Tokyo office, basically, of PlayStation, just before the PlayStation 2 was announced, like about 6 months before that, and I went there. But it's good to get out. It's good to get out. I couldn't get back to Kyoto. I wanted really to come back to Kyoto, but I couldn't get out to Kyoto, so because they don't have an office in Kyoto. So I said, okay, next best, Tokyo.
You're heading in the right direction, right?
Basically, yeah.
This concludes the first part of the 2-part series of the discussion with Dylan and Hollie. I hope you enjoyed part 1, and stay tuned because part 2 is coming up.